Hey, welcome, Faithful Politics listeners and viewers. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by, we'll call him Josh number one. He is your faithful host. How's it going, Josh?
I'm doing well, number two.
And joining us today is Josh number two. This is Josh Lewis. He is the host of the Saving Elephants podcast, and he's also a CPA who lives in Tulsa. That's in Oklahoma, for those that don't have a map. He is a former candidate for city auditor with a decade of experience in auditing governments. He has a very unique and practical perspective of politics, as he is a millennial and he is a conservative. And he decided to step down as the treasurer of the Tulsa County Republican Party in 2016 when he could no longer support the candidate who would then soon become the president and is now formerly known as the former guy. So welcome, Josh, to the show.
Thank you, guys. It's good to be here.
Hey, Josh, I couldn't help but wonder if you have any relation or any, because I noticed you went to the College of the Ozarks, and I wonder, do you know Marty Byrd or any of his associates in the Navarro cartel, like from the Ozarks and Netflix? Because he was an accountant, too. Was your life any that exciting at all, or no?
I choose to not incriminate myself by responding to that.
That's good. The Navarro would be very happy about that.
Yes.
Yeah. So Josh, and this is going to be weird. So Josh number one, I'm just going to call you Burtram, and because of our guest, you're going to actually be able to keep your namesake Josh. So
awesome.
Josh, like, what's your podcast about?
Well, Saving Elephants, as the name sort of audaciously implies, is an attempt to call millennials or younger Americans, or anyone who wants to listen, back to what I would call a healthier, more cerebral version of intellectual conservatism, and not the conservatism that is often branded, as we see perhaps on Fox News or in the media at large. And so it is. You know, I often like to say a lot of political podcasts do current events. I tend to focus mostly on non-current events, which is people that may have died 200 years ago. Because it turns out, as any good conservative knows, when you read the fathers and mothers of an intellectual tradition, they usually had more intelligent things to say than what usually passes for civil discourse these days. And so I just think it's needful, as I've dug into this stuff, I over and over have this feeling of, why was I never introduced to these guys before? Why am I just now hearing it? I've been a Republican and conservative my whole life. I had no idea these arguments were out there. And I want other younger Americans to have that same experience also, to realize there's so much more than what passes at a surface level for political discourse that really is worth engaging with.
Yeah. So with kind of the millennial demographic, I mean, you're probably the first millennial conservative I've ever met, and that probably says more about sort of my circle of friends than it does about you. But I'm curious, like why would a millennial choose to, I don't know, like latch on to the ideals of the conservative party? I mean, in lieu of everything they've seen, you know, say in the past 4 or 5 years, in lieu of some of the, what's the word, like intolerance maybe for equality, equity, what have you, like if I were a millennial and you were trying to proselytize your political party to me, like what would you tell me?
Well, and it might depend on your particular background. I mean, one of the things that is unfortunate is, or I shouldn't say unfortunate, millennials are the largest generation of Americans. So it might be true that as a group we may be more predominantly left, but there are plenty of millennial conservatives out there. Now, in the way you were describing it, yes, it is true. It's a much smaller group of millennials that, say, have any affinity to the current Republican Party as currently branded. They do exist, and they are very strongly affiliated or associated or indebted to it, I guess. They tend to be very countercultural. They tend to uphold values of not being politically correct. You know, sometimes younger Americans, and by the way, the youngest millennials, or the oldest millennials rather, which I'm pushing that end, will soon be 40. So we are talking about young Americans, but we're not talking about people just going into college. It's sort of those in the young professional stages of their lives.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm a millennial, Will. It's 1981 to 1996 is the. Anyway, go ahead.
And that's honestly, we could spend an entire hour arguing about what the actual cutoffs are. I often say it's really the baby boomers is the only generation we get that have definite bookends. Everybody else we kind of on the margins argue. But a more direct answer to your question, Will, I think what would entice younger Americans is we are particularly frustrated, say, with the lack of authenticity within political discourse. And I think millennials are more open to the prospects as a group of understanding that our debt or our inability to pay back future expenses is a burden that it turns out we are going to have to figure out. You know, the baby boomers spent all the money. We're the ones who have to pay for it. And that is in alignment most often with conservative projects. But beyond that, yes. And I say this often, like if you think about it, two of the most popular candidates in recent memory among younger Americans were Bernie Sanders and Ron Paul. These are aging, wrinkly white males, right? This is not who millennials are supposed to. You know, every time we're trying to appeal to younger Americans, we trot out some multiracial, multi-gender younger candidate, and they just flop with younger Americans. Well, what was unique about Ron Paul and Bernie Sanders, and I'm not a supporter of either of them, but what was unique about them is they both spoke in an authentic, outside the Beltway language. And I think that is something that the conservative intellectual tradition, and there are other traditions, it's not just conservatism. There's, socialism, for instance, appeals to millennials. But it's something other than the standard liberal orthodoxy we currently have that is in some way losing steam among younger Americans. And my hope is that conservatism is what I think is more in tune with human nature and is a safer, more secure, and more prosperous road forward would ultimately be appealing to my generation.
That makes a lot of sense, Josh. I'm intrigued by your podcast, and I'm intrigued by you as a person. We probably have a lot to, offer, like in terms of a lot in common is what I mean. Probably you and I and our thoughts and our views. I was thinking, like when I made that little joke about millennials, I'm assuming, Will, that you're Generation X, like when we were born in the 70s. Well, yeah, so I came from a family where half of us were born in the 70s and the other half were born in the early 80s. And so there is like this weird generational cutoff. And I was going to say, the baby boomers have spent all the money. They keep spending all the money. I don't know if you've noticed that. They're still in power, and they keep spending all the money. I don't know what you Gen Xers are going to do, Will. You better do something better than what we've inherited. But my question, why? So you said that you feel like the younger, generation, the millennials, that it's hard to predict kind of their political maybe affiliation. Like there's, we're getting surprised, and it seems like this kind of really far leaning left ideology is not as popular, you're saying, or is waning in popularity amongst the younger generations. And I guess my question is, why do you think that is? Well, why do you say that, I guess, first? And then why do you think that's the case?
Why do I think it's the case that, say, the far left is waning in popularity?
Yeah, that it's waning. Yeah, this liberal ideology, more liberal ideology as it's defined today, is waning. And you said it's a waning in the kind of millennial or even younger generations. So my question is, why do you say that? Like, what makes you say that? And then why do you think that's the case? Why do you think that's happening?
Well, and that's a good question. That's a deep question that I'm probably going to give a very unsatisfactory answer toward. And,
okay.
As I had said earlier, millennials being the largest generation of Americans thus far, you could kind of say anything about us and it would probably be true in some sense. And so, yes, there are strong Trumplican millennials. There are, the AOC millennials, those who are very much on the far left. I'm blanking on the name. You had a prior guest that I know at one point had kind of described the horseshoe theory and talked about fascism and communism. And I think what he said was completely spot on, which is you would be hard-pressed to find a genuine fascist or communist in the United States. And that is true of younger Americans as well, by which I mean I think Americans, we as a people, are mostly non-radical. We're mostly politically ambivalent. There's a very tiny percentage of us that are all that, weirdos like us actually interested in this stuff. And even though we're weirdos, not necessarily radical in our approach, that's a very small percentage of Americans. And so the further left or the further right you get, I think just naturally isn't appealing to Americans per se. Younger Americans, not just millennials, but younger Americans in general have, maybe you could say younger humans, are always more easily attracted to radical ideologies. But that's typically a pretty exhaustive group that as they get older, the typical as they get married and go to college and have children and have a job, they tend to kind of marginalize or moderate in their worldviews. A lot of what is on offer on the left that is very radical is for that reason not particularly appealing to younger Americans. But honestly, you could say the same of the right. I think there's a sense of which, when I was speaking earlier about authenticity, I don't necessarily mean radicalism. I mean rather this idea that what we have now led to the Iraq War, and it led to the 2008 market collapse. And it led to, we could just go on with kind of a general notion that our elites have led us astray. And as a conservative, I don't necessarily completely buy that message. I don't think populism is the answer in all cases. Sometimes the establishment or the intelligentsia is in fact helpful. But I think there is a sense in which there is political gridlock that we're not happy with, that there's this sort of overall notion there has to be a better way to do this. That is not necessarily conducive to trying to explain everything through some sort of a hierarchy of all that is wrong with the world can be explained through oppression versus oppressor, or the oppressor versus the victim. Some of it can, and so I do think you see elements of the left. But what we often see, and again, like I said earlier, millennials are pushing 40. Usually when we talk about younger Americans, we talk about those sort of the woke ideologies on college campuses. Now, it does remain to be seen. I am open to this idea that maybe Gen Z is, in fact, a more radical generation. But I don't know yet. I think what we often see is a mischaracterization of what's taking place in very small elite circles in Ivy League colleges, and the predominant population is not, in fact, that radical.
Yeah, that's really good. And so I'm curious. Well, what's a critique? What's a critique of conservatism that you feel is accurate? Whether it's a sort of like a macro critique, like just because of the actions of the party, and or just basically like things that Republicans have done that have sort of brought it upon themselves, and then maybe critiques from the left, that either was taken out of proportion or not. I mean, I know for myself, like as a Democrat, as progressive, there are a lot of critiques that I would probably say, yeah, that they may have a point, I'll give you an easy one, like defund the police. Like there's Republicans think that Democrats want to defund the police, and even though there may be, a small chorus of voices that say we don't want to defund the police, but there's also a large volume of voices that are like, no, we actually meant that. We actually meant we want to take away money from the police. So I'm curious on what's your critique on the right that you think is accurate.
Wow, where do I begin? It's just all, and well, to be honest with you, it depends in a large part on what we mean by conservatism or the right, because conservatism fits within the broader right, but it is not the right. There's a lot on the right that wouldn't be definitive of conservatism. The name saving elephants implies that there's an awful lot of saving to be doing. Probably number one in my mind is the critique of, say, the Republican Party, if we just focus on that, is I think the most abhorrent thing that's taken place in our lifetimes is, for the first time, other than if we, talk about maybe the Civil War, we lacked a peaceful transfer of power that has largely gone unrecognized on large parts of the right, by which I specifically mean the events of January the 6th. But honestly, even prior to that, there'd be 3-month lead up of constant drumbeats of this election is a fraud, it's a sham, we can't trust the electoral process. Now, I'm not being critical of every view out there that there could be legitimate ways in which we would tighten election laws, or there may be some misappropriations that took place. I'm open to that general idea. But the idea that we had a presidential candidate in absence of actual evidence or winning court cases that was continuously trying to undermine our system, aided and abetted by, to whatever degree they actually believed it, congressional Republicans and their counterpoints in the media, I think is atrocious. That is the antithesis of what it means to be an American. You know, and especially for a conservative party, which values so much this idea of the root and the heart of the American founding and order. Now, that being said, and this is in no way apology for that, but there is an awful lot. If you pull back from that very tiny minority that knew what the hell they were doing, quite frankly, what you generally see is a very large group of Americans who I think are very civic-minded and very confused, who think the election was stolen. And so that's not necessarily those advocating authoritarianism or trying to undermine the democratic order. It's just those who have been led astray. But that, and I don't want to just focus on that, but I guess that's in my mind like the number one thing that comes to mind. In 2016, when Trump was running against Hillary Clinton, he straight up told us during the debates, I will keep you in suspense on election night, whether I will concede the results of the race. He alleged then that there was so much fraud. Of course, the smart money at that time was that Trump was going to lose. Who honestly thought he could win this thing in 2016? And so this is who he always was. This was not a January 6th event. This is a large part of the right is a kind of an unwillingness to play by the system itself, what we would call an illiberal right. That word often gets misused. And there is an illiberal left, too. It's not just indicative of the right. Those who say, well, we can't win in a fair match, so we're going to have to bend the rules because the other side's being so unfair also. And that kind of whataboutism is poisonous, and it exists on both sides. It's an interesting thought experiment if you do listen to podcasts or voices on the other side. I always find it fascinating. They're almost always talking about things that the other side's not talking about. How often in Democratic circles are they, I don't know, well, maybe you could clue me in here. Do you guys sit around genuinely discussing defund the police? Or if you show up at a meeting, there's one guy there that's what he's all about. I'm not saying these people don't exist, but you kind of get this notion on the right that every other Democrat, that's their bread and butter. That's what they want. It's what I think David French of the Dispatch calls nut picking, right? We find the nuttiest guy on both sides and we say this isn't representative of the whole. And it's not that they don't exist, but I think there is a need, and this is part of the Saving Elvis Project, is I think conservatism, if it is a healthy, thoughtful, mature version of it, is extraordinarily compelling at a national level and in a political sense. And so an awful lot of what I try to do is just address the nuts on my side, if that makes sense. Because if my side were ever sane, honestly, if the left were ever sane, I don't think they'd lose an election. It's kind of odd, but we spend so much time picking apart the other side where it turns out if we could clean our own house, I think that would go much further in advancing our causes.
Yeah, there's this amazing, this scripture comes to mind from the Bible. I'm the pastor, so I have to say something from the Bible or I'm not legitimate, So the one where it says judgment begins in the house of God, or, begins in our own house. So this idea that, you have to kind of be self-critical first. And that's kind of one of those, I would say, proverbs of conservatism, I feel like, or even of critical thinking, is that you have to be self-critical. And if you're not applying things to yourself, you shouldn't apply them to other people. This idea of not being a hypocrite. And, thinking about this hypocrisy, conservatives, right, or Republicans were supposed to be the people that want to balance the budget, right? Mm-hmm. And they want to, make sure that we're not going into debt anymore. They want to, they're supposed to be the ones that are not about big government, but they're about pushing the power to the people, shrinking government, stuff like that. And then we had COVID, but that wasn't the only time. right? But we have Republicans spending a lot of money, printing a lot of money, having huge bills go through. And of course, we have Democrats that happens the same. But I was curious as to your thoughts, like thinking about COVID and then even looking back. How have Republicans, in your mind, as an auditor, how have they done in terms of keeping their promises of small government, things like that, and even in their spending? You can use COVID as a test
example.
case.
Yeah. Well, I think
what's going on there.
And as I think I had introduced to both of you gentlemen, that part of my day job is I do evaluate the regulations that are imposed upon governments when they're spending and I'm blanking off the top of my head. I think we're up to 4, maybe 5 trillion spent in the combined Trump and Biden administrations on COVID-related efforts. But let me start in a broad sense. Ever since the 1980s, and maybe even further back, but certainly since the 1980s, I think both parties discovered it's really easy to lower taxes and it's really easy to increase spending. It's not easy to shrink government. And so the Republican Party, unfortunately, the natural inclination is to lower taxes, and I'm largely for lowering taxes depending on which ones we're talking about, but not to concurrently find ways to rein in government spending. And that's the original model, right? Lower taxes, shrink the size of government. Turns out that second part that we have not yet figured out a way to do. And let's just be honest with ourselves, because this is something politicians very rarely say. I haven't checked the numbers recently. In the Obama years, when Obama was in the White House, there were certain years in which if you were to close down every federal department and disband the United States military, which would be more draconian than I think anybody other than maybe anarchists are advocating, you would still run deficits at a federal level in some years. And the reason is because of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And this is one of my hobby horses. If a politician says that they want to balance the budget and they're not increasing taxes and they're not going to touch entitlement reform, they're either lying to you or they're misinformed, because the math just doesn't work. The only way we could ever effectively balance a budget at a federal level, this isn't applicable to state and local governments, but at a federal level, is to effectively deal with these entitlement programs. Now, whether that means we take the Bernie Sanders approach of just we're going to increase taxes on wealthy Americans, I'm not for that, but that's a legitimate argument. Let's at least be reasonable about this and actually, call a spade a spade. We're talking about a massive burden we don't yet know how to fund, and we millennials are going to have to figure that out. That being said, George W. Bush spent more than his predecessors, but he was succeeded by Barack Obama, who spent more than his predecessors. And had Donald Trump, if you extrapolate out, had he had 2 terms, he would have spent more than his predecessors. It certainly looks like Joe Biden is on par with that. So we now have 4 presidential administrations, again, extrapolated outward. And at least with Donald Trump, I can say this to his favor. At least he made no bones about the fact, hey, I'm not here to, he talked about draining the swamp, but that was not in the traditional conservative sense of we're just going to reduce the size of government. It was more there's bad actors in here, and by golly, I'm going to run them out. So there's a lot of hypocrisy. There's a lot of inauthenticity. There's a lot of dishonesty around this general notion of reducing the size of government. And part of it, I think, is just sheer exhaustion, that it turns out it's not that popular as a politician if you actually start to get into this. We tried to, Bush, I'll give him some credit, tried some sort of entitlement reform of Social Security as far as maybe making a portion of it privatizing. One could argue whether or not that was a good or a bad idea, but it was at least some basic attempt to say, hey, maybe we need to do something different with this. This is, again, an unfunded liability I don't know how I'm going to pay for. On top of the fact that we now have trillions spent on a virus mitigation. Now, let me be clear as a conservative. I'm not a hardcore libertarian. I'm not an anarchist. If we're at war or if we're going through a once-in-a-century pandemic, there are legitimate, or honestly, I would even say the 2008 market collapse. There are legitimate arguments for when a federal government or a central authority may step in and spend a ton of money that we don't yet know how to pay for. This is the father of a family of 4 has life-threatening cancer and has to raid his pension to save his life. And thank God it works, but they're going to be paying this off. But what you don't do when you raid your pension fund is you act as if you won the lottery. Right? This is an emergency. This is not oh, good, look at all this money we've got floating around. And this is unfortunately, and I think some of this is our political gridlock and the way Congress does not work. I am critical of both the CARES Act under the Trump administration and then the American Recovery Plan Act, or ARPA, under the Biden administration. those trillion-dollar programs that were meant to address COVID. They're largely the same. The main difference is under Trump, it was more explicitly for COVID, whereas the ARP Act under Biden is a combination of COVID remediation and also economics. I wouldn't call it stimulus, but recovery, as they call it. They're complicated pieces of legislation, and so I'm not just completely for or against it. I mean, I could spend an inordinate amount of time giving you really boring facts about what else in those bills that we probably don't want to bore the audience with. But the bottom line is, this is a father has cancer, and we have to raid the pension account. Now, there are good ways to do that and bad ways to do that, but let's at least have the sobriety to talk about this and say this sucks. We're going to have to pay it back. Maybe it was misspent. I know for a fact in some cases it was misspent. It was probably a little overboard because, unfortunately, we saw this in the Obama administration too, that you have this sort of national crisis. It opens the gateway for multiple interest groups to get their specific, here's what I want funded. And they're not bad things. Let me be clear there. It's an opportunity cost. Well, did it make sense to pay for that versus all the other things we might have been paying for? And so, Josh, I don't know if I feel like I'm giving an extraordinarily broad answer, and you may have asked a more specific question. Did I address your question?
Yeah, you did. I mean, I think that it's like basically the Republicans and the Democrats, like the Republicans they haven't really gone by their word. And one of the problems is that what I heard you say is one of the problems is it's not easy to shrink government.
No. Because
now government has its own incentives. When you start a department, it's got its own incentives to stay funded. Because it's their jobs. You know what I mean? They gotta do so. So, like, when you create something and imagining you can just create it and then take it away, that's a very naive way to view
this is
the world in any organization, not just the federal government, in any organization, although other organizations might have more ability to just close a section or a sector down if needed.
One thing I wanted to kind of address, and it sort of picks up on a point that both you and Burtram made in regards to, like the sides of government. I mean, as sort of a, person that studies like political science and history, I mean, Republicans have done a pretty good job at expanding the government. I would say easily within the last 50 years, if not further back. And it's like whether it's Nixon, EPA, OSHA, or even Bush with like DHS, TSA, DIA. I mean, like, and there's a whole bunch more I'm missing. And then like with Trump, with Space Force, like each of these government entities, and to Bertrand's point about like they exist just to sustain themselves, and it's like a self-licking ice cream cone, like they don't want to go away because they feel that their development, their creation has some level of importance or significance, whether it's true or not. I mean, maybe there is a purpose for me to still take off my shoes, 20 some odd years later after 9/11 when I'm at the airport. Maybe. I don't know.
Well, clearly you should take off your shoes.
No, clearly I should not take off my shoes. If you ask any of my old Army buddies, they will tell you that is a national security liability just waiting to happen. But I digress. So with Republicans, in my view, seemingly kind of being the ones that are perpetuating this larger, government. I mean, it seems like the America 2.0 to sort of reduce our deficit. It's like I don't foresee Republicans being the one that shrinks government. Maybe it's the Democrats, or maybe it never gets shrunken. Maybe we don't have to shrink it. Maybe I don't know. Like, what do you think?
I mean, your point's well taken, and I as I kind of mentioned earlier, it is almost refreshing that Republicans have largely dropped the rhetoric of limiting or shrinking government in recent years, because at least now they're being honest with what they're actually doing. And I say largely, that's not completely true. I don't have an easy solution for how you shrink government. The most draconian solution is we might in fact find out, I hope not, but we might in fact find out, well, what happens when at some point do you cross some line and we end up in such economic free-for-all that both parties are like, okay, we'll shrink it now because it turns out this is worse than we ever thought. I hope that doesn't happen. But it is at least a possibility. And unfortunately, it may be even more insidious. What appears to be more likely is is kind of the Argentina, or especially the Japanese model, which is just you end up in this sort of malaise stasis where it's like a permanent, you can't get the economy rolling again. You're kind of stuck. And on the outside, it looks like, well, you're a very powerful economy, but nobody feels like they have opportunities anymore because everybody's just sort of stuck and you're consistently paying back debt. Those are complex issues because there are aspects in which, as a conservative, there are times when I think it makes sense to spend money. And I would even say largely, in my younger years, I was all for tax cuts. And as I matured a little bit, I was for spending cuts because it's artificial to just cut taxes and not spending because eventually somebody has to pay for it. I'm really for more reduction of what government does now. I'm not as focused on the tax or the spending. It's more, let's have an honest conversation with, should government be doing these things? Now, there are a lot of good things, but by should they be doing it, I mean, should they be doing this at the expense of the private sector doing it or us being able to fund something else? Maybe there's a legitimate reason for Space Force. Maybe there's a legitimate concern that in the near future, if we're not first in space, we could have a military disadvantage. Maybe there's a legitimate reason for Obamacare. Maybe there's a legitimate reason for these things. But if we focus first on what is the appropriate role of government and what are we actually hoping to empower it to do, I think that's where we can begin to have these conversations. Like I said, the Bernie Sanders model is, I don't think the math works, but is at least a little bit more intellectually honest in that it's like, well, we're going to have to pay for these things. Now, it's not intellectually honest in the sense that he never seems to provide us the actual plan for how that happens. Because if you run the math, it's like, well, that works for a couple of years and then we're out of money again. But that is and I think that's part of my point is, if we were living as if we were actually paying for all these goodies the government produces, I think 99% of Americans would quickly say, hell no, I'm not paying for this anymore. Like, if we actually had to, the equivalent of what we owe in debt at this point is most of us would no longer live in a home. We'd not have a car. We certainly couldn't send our kids to college. We'd be just barely scraping by. I don't think most Americans support that. And so I'm not for the draconian measure if we just get rid of all of it. But at least let's start with an honest conversation. And you're right. Well, my party has not had the best track record of this. Back to Josh's point he made much earlier, the baby boomers are still in charge. Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama were all born in the same freaking year. Donald Trump and Joe Biden aren't much better. I mean, Biden's even older. It's not just measured by how old the president is, but at some point we need to break outside this baby boomer model and stop spending our grandchildren and great-grandchildren's money.
Yeah, totally. I was thinking, there's a couple things I was thinking. One, I just wanted to throw out there like this theory. It could be a conspiracy theory. I'm going to throw it out there, and then I'm going to move on. All right. But and then I have a real question. But the conspiracy theory, maybe not, but it might be a conspiracy, it might not. But the reason that we spend so much on defense, and the reason that we have such a huge army and have such a huge military presence and technology, is because we know we're never going to pay back this money. And so when people come to get it back, we just have the guns to say, yeah, come and get it. Sure, yeah, I'll pay you back. Come take it. And we have a big enough military so that if they try to get all their money back, essentially we're like, nope, you're not getting it back. And we have bigger guns than you. So that's just a theory, because, again, getting your money back implies that the person's going to pay it back. And when they don't, it implies that you have recourse to get it back. And if the other person has big enough guns, you may not have recourse to get it back.
But anyway, I was going to say, that this next upcoming budget is like $43 billion more than what they asked for last year. So I think it's like
dude.
800 something rather. I can't remember. They were meeting up on the Hill recently, kind of talking about it. But it's like you look at that dollar amount and you think, okay, so we're out of Afghanistan. Okay, good. So troops are back home. They're not in a wartime effort. We're not paying, KBR tons of money to do logistics for us. Why do we need this increased funding? Can't you just sort of, sharpen the pencil a little bit and find other places? Because it's expensive.
It's inflation, man.
Yeah, I mean, it's expensive to run a military. I mean, having been in the military and worked on a military base, to keep the lights on and to pay the civil workers to, do a variety of things from take out the trash to install a toilet, But I have no idea where all this money is coming from, though. So maybe you're right. I don't know.
Yeah, it's coming from somewhere. But my question is, I mean, you can comment on that if you want, Josh. But my question is, so the normal person, we hear you saying these things, and you sound right. You say it with confidence, and I'm sure that's because, obviously you're intelligent and you've looked at these numbers. But how would we test what you say or what anyone else says, for that matter? How would we go and say, hey, they're spending my great-grandchildren's money? How would we even go and see that, figure that out? What would be some solid next steps that you would recommend to someone who is interested to be able to kind of, test this and see for themselves what's going on?
Yeah, and I'm unfortunately unarmed with sort of the facts and figures or exactly where I could take you to at the moment. I will say...
That's okay. Just method.
Right. In terms of...
I'm
blanking on that. I think it's nationaldebtclock.com. I could be wrong about the website, but that keeps a pretty good track of what our current debt is. And a lot of what I'm talking about is projection. Because there is a sense in which we have been wrong about what the future holds. And this is why I was kind of trying to temper my, as you say, confidence earlier with, I don't actually know what the red line is. A lot of this, I think, speaks to your political philosophy or underlying ideology of what happens when a nation state outspends itself. Now, in direct answer to your, as you say, your potential conspiracy theory, that analogy works one time. Because the problem isn't so much that we're concerned China's going to come knocking on our doorstep and demand U.S. dollars. The problem is China's going to say, okay, cool, I guess we're done buying debt from you. And that's the real nightmare scenario. If you if you got a house from a bank and then refused to pay it back, that's one thing. But what we're actually talking about is continuing to fund the American project year after year. It doesn't matter how big our military is unless we're actively talking about invading other countries and stealing their resources, which tends to be more costly in the process. That's not necessarily a method that works. So if that is in fact a conspiratorial potential of the United States military, I think it may be ill-conceived and unlikely to work. But in that regard, this is oftentimes a lot of what we would call a projection. I don't know if let's just assume we never reconcile, we never get our house in order, and we just continue down this path. Does that mean we have some sort of a Great Depression 2.0 in which credit just dries up and there's no more cash available? I don't think so. I suspect what it means is, does it mean record inflation? Does it mean more like a Japanese model where we cease to have any economic vitality and input? It's really hard to say. I think part of what a conservative model presumes is that there is a link between what Edmund Burke used to call the three generations, which there have always been and always will be only three generations. Those who are here, that's the three of us, those who have died, and those who are yet to have been born. And this general notion that society owes a debt of obligation both to its traditions but also to those still yet to come. And what we've been doing, in a sense, is living off this sort of borrowed time of we're not as considerate of what happens when we say burn down the rainforest. Who's going to get to enjoy this? Now, in direct answer to your question, as far as how would you check this math? So I'm trying to say as an underlying basis, there's no website I could point to and say on this date at this ratio, this is what's going to happen from an economic perspective. What I can do is say if you look at congressional budgets, I believe the whitehouse.gov would have, or if you just look at the unfunded liability of Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and the projections that there's, and unfortunately part of the reason I'm stumbling on my words is there's a ton of not-for-profit and also government agencies that are charged with looking into this. I am blanking off of the main, there's like an official authoritative group the United States government uses to try to project for its unfunded liability to determine what they're going to fund in future years, and I am blanking on its name. Maybe I could shoot it to you guys. You can put it in show notes if you want to.
That's why we have the god of Google.
Yes,
so we can just type in Medicare projections.
Right. But that's the general idea. Is these numbers are, they're almost so ubiquitous that it's difficult for me to point to a single source. But unfortunately, there's no single authoritative source that says here's what happens if you don't fund it, other than we know what the numbers are based on projections and when Americans are likely to die and retire. Here's what we're going to be owing in the next 20, 30, 40 years. I believe by 2040, if I'm not mistaken, all three become completely unfundable at current levels, which is not that far away. But it's so again, that doesn't, what happens? I don't know. Do we... What do we do at that point? What happens to the economy? I mean, it's sort of an unknown question. I would prefer we not find out.
Yeah,
same here.
Yeah, kind of in the remaining time we've got, do you have any quick thoughts about what's happening in Ukraine right now with the Russia invasion?
No quick thoughts. I mean, I think I'm grateful that this does seem to be an area, and who knows how long it'll last, in which there's largely solidarity among the right and left. I know, Will, you'd sent me an article where obviously there's some of the more odious grifters on the right that are, if not siding with Putin, at least dubious about our allyship with Ukraine. And let's just be honest, Ukraine is a corrupt country. It always wasn't, probably always will be. But there is no contest in the moral high ground of whose side to be on between, let's just say it, Putin versus Ukraine. It's not even the Russian people we're talking about. This is an unprovoked act of aggression against a sovereign nation that is a Democrat and an ally. I'm grateful that Americans mostly seem to be on board with that general notion. I'm also grateful we're not currently in a shooting war with Russia. I hope it stays that way. I don't advocate us getting involved directly, other than I'm also very grateful for, I mean, who would have thought the Germans and the Swiss and the whole world would have united? You know, this seemed to be the one thing that pushed us over the edge. I'm hoping it's not just, okay, we'll do this for a month or two, and then I guess I really hope this is a new world of we recognize actors such as, pardon me, an aggressive China, an aggressive Russia, are those who are, who need to be met with force, proportional to what they are willing, unfortunately, to produce, and that, but let's, this is nothing good. I mean, the best outcome is that Ukraine is destroyed, and that our economy, I mean, here, to the extent it affects us at all, is going to suffer for a long time to come. There isn't a good outcome to this. This is a terrible act of aggression, and the best we could hope for is just that the Ukrainians continue to put up a valiant fight, and the Russians eventually wear thin and give up.
Yeah. Okay, so another quick thought. Abortion bans happening in multiple states around the country, specifically Oklahoma just passing basically no abortion whatsoever. Right? Weeks of gestation be damned. So quick thoughts about that.
Again, no quick thoughts. That is an hour-long discussion. But I would say I would have to check this, and you may be able to correct me. I think it passed the House. I don't know that I don't think it's law here in Oklahoma.
Yeah, it hasn't been signed into law yet.
Okay. And I've not yet checked into what its prospects are. This is, of course, modeled somewhat after the Texas legislation. I believe Idaho just a few days ago became the first state to kind of model a similar drafting around this.
And Arizona are drafting, if they haven't drafted already, just last night.
Yeah.
Probably something with North or South Dakota, too, I saw. I don't remember if that's correct or not, but maybe not. I thought I saw it, that governor that's so popular because she's like, this lady that is like, anyway, like super beautiful, and she's in like her 50s or something. I don't remember, but
that's why she's popular.
I don't forget her name. That's why. No, they just made a big deal out of that. Like I've seen like headlines about that. That's not why she's popular. It actually shows how shallow we still are, in our reporting. But
fair enough. I mean, there's a number of different directions we could go here about the larger abortion question in general, or these specific laws. Pardon me. I think it's not a secret that by design certain legislation, especially in deep red states, have been crafted to almost create a legal conundrum, to almost push the issue, because that is a facet of what some pro-life groups are trying to do, is tie this up in the court so that we can potentially overturn Roe v. Wade, which could happen independent, in theory, of any of the legislation at this moment. I don't know that I know enough to comment about the specifics of this legislation, whether it's draconian, whether it's sensible, specific aspect, but probably a combination of both. There's probably aspects I would detest and parts I would celebrate. I am, as a conservative, pro-life. I think, broadly speaking, though, if you're asking for quick comments, if the subject turns to this, what I think is needful is that we have a consistent reminder in the society for those who are pro-life that is a pervasive worldview that by necessity extends beyond politics. That the purpose of the pro-life movement must be beyond overturning Roe v. Wade and restricting abortion access. That what we're actually talking about is a culture that seeks to understand the underlying pressures that are put on women as to why they would seek an abortion in the first place. Now, that's not the same as saying you would make it legal in such cases, but that these things have to work together. If we were to immediately end Roe v. Wade and all 50 states immediately move toward full restriction of abortion, I think a pro-life advocate would then have an enormous amount of work on their hands trying to understand the deep underlying pain and cause of what is leading to these things, and how do we minister to those who are in terrible situations. And it is an unfortunate political football that this often gets reduced to who's on the court and what the legislation is currently. So anyhow, and I could go on about that, but I guess that would be my closest to quick thoughts, Will.
Awesome. No, that's really good. So every time we have people on from another podcast, I always like to kind of play a bit of a game with them, and you are no exception. So with no further ado, we are going to play a game called Biden, Bible, or Buffy. I'm dangerous. I got these buttons
Nice.
that play these sounds. So the premise of the game is I'm going to be giving you some quotes from either Biden from the Bible or Buffy from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which was an American supernatural drama television series based on the movie from 1992. It ran from 97 to 2003. I figured that since that show came out during the millennial era, it was sort of fitting for your particular skill set and knowledge. So if you've never seen the show, you're probably really going to suck at this game. But if you have, these are real common quotes that any, Buffy bride, Buffy person will know. So are you ready to play?
I am. I'm assuming there's no crossovers, right? There's only one correct answer for each quote.
I have no idea. I don't watch the show. But
Yes, assume that.
My wife does. And I'm going to pose. Both of you guys are going to have a chance. So Josh number one, and then Burtram. So for Josh number one, you will get the first quote. So here it is: "Love isn't brains, children. It's blood." Is that Biden, Bible, or Buffy?
It's either Biden or Buffy. I'm going to go with Buffy.
All right, you got it. Great. That's 12 points. All right, Burtram.
Yes.
It's your turn. So now you get a quote. So how about here we go. Your quote. "Wait, your mom's still alive?" Is that Biden, Bible, or Buffy?
Buffy.
Oh, I am so sorry, Bertram. Negative 1,000 points. So that was actually Biden. Yeah, the St. Patrick's Day.
Biden.
The St. Patrick's Day reception for the Irish Prime Minister Brian Cohen in 2010. Biden noted that the visitor's mother had lived in America. Let's see. So going back to you, Josh, number one. Let me see. All right, here we go. Here's your quote. "Stand up, Chuck. Let 'em see you." Is that Biden, Bible, or Buffy?
I'm going with Biden this time.
All right, excellent. Yeah, it was during a 2008 campaign rally in Missouri. Biden asked the audience to applaud State Senator Chuck Graham. Graham, a paraplegic following a car accident, is confined to a wheelchair. So that was Biden. Okay, so great job.
That's rough.
You've got 1,000,000 points. Okay, Burtram, your turn. Here we go. As for those agitators, I wish they would go the whole way and emasculate themselves. Is that Biden, Bible, or Buffy?
That is Bible. The Apostle Paul. Actually.
All right, that's right. It comes from Galatians.
I get more. I know it came from Galatians. I get more points for that.
So you're back on the board with 2 points. Okay, so let's see. Josh, number 1. Here we go. Your quote: "I may be dead, but I'm still pretty."
I really want to say Biden, but I'm going to go with Buffy.
All right, you got it. Awesome, great job. All right, and finally, I forgot to put points on the board for you. So you got 1,000,000,000 points for that last one. Okay, Burtram, your last and final question. Are you ready? Here we go. You think you know what's to come, what you are. You haven't even begun. Is that Biden, Bible, or Buffy? Are you Googling these? I heard the clickety-clack of the keyboard.
It's Buffy.
All right. Great job. Well, thanks for both of our listeners and our guests for answering the question and for playing Biden, Bible, or Buffy. Awesome. Well, that's the last of my sound effects. So if you guys turned off the episode, just turn it back on now. Not that you can hear me. But anyways, hey, thanks, Josh, for coming on the show. Where can people find more about you, your podcast, and kind of what you're up to?
Yeah, thanks. It's been great to be here. Saving Elephants. If you're searching in your podcast platform, Saving Elephants, you can find me. If you Google me, it turns out I compete with all the people trying to save elephants. So you're going to have to try either savingelefantsblog.com, or you can do Saving Elephants Josh or Saving Elephants Conservative. That'll probably get you to me.
All right, great. And then when do you guys release your episodes?
First and third Tuesday of every month. I've kept that up for what'll soon be 4 years now.
Wow, that's awesome. Cool. And so make sure you guys go out there and do that. Saving Elephants blog, Josh. And thanks again, Josh, for everything, for coming on.
It's great to be here, guys.
All right. Take care, guys. And we will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.